What does the National Conventional Arms Control Act entail, and why the need for regulation?
Well, essentially why South Africa has a particular piece of legislation like this is to provide a regulatory framework to establish the necessary structures to provide effective control of South Africa's arms exports. And the reason why this particular legislation came about is South Africa has a checkered history of arms trading, particularly under the apartheid era, and there were some very problematic deals that went down in that particular era, and there were some concerns that were raised by President Mandela, who set up a commission of inquiry, which was the Cameron Commission of Inquiry, to investigate all these controversial, highly problematic allegations of arms dealings that had taken place up until the mid-1990s. And this Commission of Inquiry recommended the establishment of this particular piece of legislation. And what one saw was a cabinet memorandum being established in the mid-1990s, which then eventually led to this particular legislation in 2002.
In terms of this legislation, what types of countries would be acceptable for trade in arms and which types unacceptable?
Well, the Act sets up or establishes certain criteria on this. The criteria is fairly broad, but it does have a number of key principles within this criteria. The one is it strongly recommends that South Africa should not be selling arms to countries where there are systematic human rights abuses taking place, where there are violations of fundamental freedoms, when there's internal repression taking place. Unfortunately, it doesn't go any further on those particular criteria. That's what it establishes. There's a range of other criteria. There are others that include South Africa should not be selling arms to countries that violate end-user certificates. Now, end-user certificates are certificates where a country who receives South African arms will sign a document that says we will not re-export these arms, we will not sell on these arms, we will not pass these arms on to any other party, country, rebel group without consulting with South Africa first. And you obviously don't want to be selling arms to countries that continually violate that pass them on to problematic groups, non-state groups, terrorist groups. There are also concerns about South Africa should not be selling arms to countries or regions that it may affect some sort of military or security balance. That there is, for example, tension within a particular region, and selling certain categories of arms to that region may tip the security balance and may actually lead to armed conflict. So those are kind of the key aspects in terms of the criteria, but it doesn't lay down that there are certain countries that South Africa can't export to. The only thing that's clear within the Act is South Africa cannot export arms to countries that are subject to United Nations Security Council arms embargo, which South Africa is compelled to follow those, and that is in black and white. The rest are open to interpretation and open to essentially decisions. Decisions can be made by the National Conventional Arms Control Committee on these particular issues.
What is the composition and purpose of the National Conventional Arms Control Committee?
Well, the committee is a cabinet committee, so it's the members of that committee are made up from cabinet, so it's ministers and deputy ministers that sit on the committee. And one of the key aspects of it is that the chair of the committee cannot have a portfolio that's linked to the arms industry in some direct way. So, for example, the Minister of Defence, or the Deputy Minister of Defence, or the Minister of Intelligence, or Deputy Minister of Intelligence, or Trade and Industry, for example, cannot be the chairperson of the committee. So in the past we had Kader Asmal, who was the Minister of Water Affairs. We've had Sidney Mufamadi, who was in a non-security defence portfolio, and now we have Jeff Khadebe, who's the Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs, who heads it up. But then, of course, there are subcommittees and groupings below this cabinet committee. There's a scrutiny committee which will look at every single license application, export license application that will essentially be made. Then there's a directorate for conventional arms control that's based within the defence structures, and that has to deal with all the sort of secretarial functions, all the administrative functions of South Africa's arms exports.
Why has the NCACC not provided annual reports on South Africa's arms trade since 2005 in blatant disregard of the requirements of the Act?
Well, I think to answer that question, we need to look at the actual Act. And the Act stipulates that the NCACC has to make annual reports to Parliament. And these annual reports are supposed to be made publicly available. The NCACC is also supposed to provide Parliament with, but specifically the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Defence, and now Defence and Veterans Affairs, with quarterly reports, but these quarterly reports are to remain classified because they're about pending arms deals, that applications that have been provided to the NCACC for their consideration. Now, the issue here is that the NCACC is supposed to provide annual reports in the following year, but by the end of the first quarter, and that it hasn't been doing consistently. And what it's also been doing over the past few years, actually since 2005, the 2005 annual report and onwards up until recently, it's been providing reports to the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Defence and now Defence and Veterans Affairs, but it's been marking the reports as classified, which actually is in violation of the Act. The Act, in terms of its wording and the requirements, of these reports are supposed to be made public and are not. And this is the point that the Democratic Alliance has made, and it seems to be the point that the current chair, the new chair of the NCACC, doesn't seem to have in a way emphasized or prioritized, because within the minister's press release that came out, Minister Khadebe, he stipulates very, very clearly and accurately that reports have been made to Parliament, but the reports have only been made to the Parliamentary Committee and they've remained classified, which defeats the whole point of a transparency components of this Act, which is one of the central components of the Act, is Parliament can essentially do nothing. It can't respond to these reports because they're classified. So essentially what's happened is you've had a Member of Parliament who has raised some of these issues. He's not declaring the sources of where he got the information from, but he's certainly raising issues about about secrecy and essentially what we've seen as a return to secrecy in terms of South Africa's export control regime.
In your paper, you agree with the DA that South Africa's arms export control regime is in crisis. Why do you say this?
Well, indeed, it's been in crisis up until recently, because what we saw before the end of the first quarter of this year was the NCACC was dissolved, and that happened following the cabinet resignations around essentially Thabo Mbeki's resignation from office. And there were many cabinet ministers who were sitting on the NCACC who resigned as a result of that. What the Act does provide for, in terms of many of the provisions, is it allows for a temporary measure to be in place. And the temporary measure is essentially for the chair or the deputy chair to be making decisions and consultations with other government departments. But that measure is only supposed to be in place under exceptional circumstances, and this is acknowledged in the media release by Minister Khadebe. Essentially, the problem has been that temporary measure has been in place for more than 6 months. Also, the biggest crisis that I see, and I think it's a crisis for the South African public, is that it's a crisis of transparency, that we're seeing the NCACC returning to the era of secrecy. It's important that there is transparency, and the actual legislation, which I have in front of me, in its preamble, emphasizes the importance of transparency, and that's what we've seen as transparency is being undermined currently, and that's why we have a crisis. And it's in the absence of transparency, government cannot be held to account. And in the absence of transparency, we have speculation, and we have all sorts of allegations that are made, and it's very difficult to verify and act on that. And we also need to take into account that South Africa's arms industry is highly dependent on exports, but is also dependent on government subsidies. Government subsidies, in some form or other, will come from taxpayers' money. So essentially, the NCACC does need to account to taxpayers, namely the public, in the sense of how it has been acting, and also explain to the public why there have been certain decisions made.
Following the uproar of the DA's allegations, Minister Jeff Khadebe, chairperson of the NCACC, issued a statement denying dodgy arms deals. Was the statement credible?
The term dodgy comes essentially from the DA, David Mania, the spokesperson for the DA on Defence and Veterans Affairs. He used the term in his media conference and in the various documentation that's come out. The minister has responded to that particular term. I wouldn't necessarily use the term dodgy, certainly controversial. Given the criteria that South Africa has in its Act about countries they should not be exporting to countries that violate human rights, that there's violation of fundamental freedoms, there's internal repression and those particular aspects. Indeed, South Africa hasn't violated any UN arms embargoes, but it has flown fairly close to the sun on some of these issues. What the DA has revealed in their documents, which has been confirmed in some respects by the minister, is that, for example, South Africa was approved the permit for certain defense equipment, namely radar surveillance equipment, to be exhibited in North Korea. Now, this isn't a violation of a UN arms embargo, but it does indicate a particular intention to possibly sell at some point in the future. And given the controversy around North Korea and the current UN embargoes in there, should South Africa be even considering or even going to visit the North Koreans and exhibiting equipment in that particular country is controversial. Also, South Africa is considering exporting to Zimbabwe. Now, look, Zimbabwe is certainly a lot calmer than it was 12 months ago. But South Africa is playing a mediator role within Zimbabwe. So the question I would ask, and I think many members of the public would ask, is given that South Africa is a mediator in Zimbabwe, should it be approving the sale of ammunition to Zimbabwe? Look, the sale of ammunition hasn't gone through. It's still pending. It's still being considered. And this is what Minister Khadebe has alluded to within his media statement. But I would say that given the sensitivity around Zimbabwe, given South Africa's role, it's not a neutral player. It's supposed to be mediating. Doesn't it send the wrong message if we're considering selling all sorts of armaments to a country like Zimbabwe?